Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom and understanding, we, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the king, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This Honorable Senate is called to order for Thursday, September 22, 2022. How the business of your country is conducted. I know that you were joining us on one occasion on Zoom, so we know that you have an interest in the Parliament. And it is a real pleasure to see you here today, and I hope that you have you enjoy the experience, and that you have the opportunity to come back and see us again sometime. So, teachers, students, welcome again to the Senate of Jamaica. Minister, I recognize you from a seat other than your own. He served as an assistant clerk, and 1968 to 78 deputy clerk. His services culminated being appointed clerk of the Houses of Parliament in 1978, a position he held until 1994. So you're looking at a man who served this Parliament from 1956 to 1994, which would have made him a spectator to the development of this country. He would have served both national heroes, Manley and Bustamante. He would have served Prime Ministers Sangster, Shearer, Michael Manley, and Edward Seaga. He would have had a bird's eye retirement in 1994. He continued to be the go-to person for the clerks in the court who had an opportunity to serve with him. He was, in truth and in fact, the archetypical clerk who carried out his duties in an impartial manner and with the dignity befitting the office. He was a font of knowledge and committed himself to imparting the principles that guided correct parliamentary practice and procedure to the Parliament and staff alike. He was a genial gentleman whose contribution to national development will not.
JP, Clerk to the Houses of Parliament, 1978 to 1994. I remember Mr. Deans well, but how do I remember him? Mr. Deans was a tall, light-skinned, dignified, handsome son of our Jamaican soil, and he was the clerk of the Jamaican Parliament for 16 years. However, he was employed to the Parliament for more than 6 decades, and he served 2 national heroes and a number of prime ministers, as the President just repeated. I met Mr. Deans when I joined the staff of the Houses of Parliament in October 1995. And I enjoyed working with him for the next 7 ensuing years until he demitted office as the consultant to the Parliament on parliamentary practice and procedure in 2002. The records of Parliament show that Mr. Deans moved up the ranks at the Houses of Parliament. He worked as assistant clerk and deputy clerk before he became clerk. And I can also recall one time Mr. Deans told me that he used to deliver bills to King's House to be assented to by the Governor General. This enabled him to gain an enormous wealth of knowledge of the work necessary to allow the wheel to spin and enable the parliamentary task he had to administer on a day-to-day basis to be executed in an efficient manner. Most, if not all, I needed to know to get my job done as assistant clerk in 1995, precedents and customs that is achieved over a period of years and is not static but very dynamic. Mr. Deans had it pat because, as you know, experience teaches wisdom. Mr. Deans loved his work. You could call on him at any time to answer any question you wanted to have answered concerning the work to be done at the Parliament. Many parliamentarians to Commonwealth parliamentary conferences all over the Commonwealth. Mr. Deans would stick his head into the chamber if he heard an uproar. At that time, he was the consultant, ready to help out if he was needed to quell any storm. At times, the Speaker or the President would suspend sit-ins for a while to facilitate persons who wished to consult with Mr. Deans in his office regarding matters of procedure which were disputed in sit-ins. And true to form, persons from both sides of the aisle would return to the sit-in happy because a consensus was reached in Mr. Deans' office on the correct procedural way to go. Another thing Mr. Deans taught me was how to constitute my seat. The first time he told me that, Dolores, constitute your seat, I was wondering what he meant. That is, to sit in my seat in the chamber minutes before the start of meetings. They will encounter this. But when they come to Parliament, they should find a safe haven of rest from this sort of behavior. And I have tried to pass that down to my staff. When Mr. Deans refused another contract and decided to stay away from the Parliament, he did only so physically. He followed what was being done on the television and would call and reprimand us if he heard or saw anything being said or done incorrectly by the chamber staff, and he pointed out what he saw or heard went wrong. Up until quite recently, some parliamentarians used to call Mr. Deans and ask him for guidance. He would help you research matters. He just had to know you wanted guidance, even if you felt bad to ask him for it. The government of Jamaica was very pleased with Mr. Deans' parliamentary work, and in 1982, he was awarded the Order of Distinction in the rank of Commander for his service to the Parliament of Jamaica. He was also appointed a Justice of the Peace, and you could rely on him to work in this capacity for you. He would, as long as he knew you. He did so with pride for parliamentarians and staff. As a justice of the peace, myself, I learned a valuable lesson from Mr. Deans, not to sign a document to verify a signature of anyone I do not know and see. One day, I invited a friend of mine to come to Parliament for Mr. Deans to verify the signature of her mother. Mr. Deans did not know my friend nor her mother, and he refused to sign the document without seeing her mother. I, today, try my best to abide by this principle. However, it was not all about work for Mr. Deans. Please indulge me as I tell you about another side of Mr. Deans. Mr. Deans had a gentle, kind, and caring heart. I happen to live in St. Catherine, and if Mr. Deans heard on the news or read in the newspaper that anything bad happened anywhere in St. Catherine, no matter how far from where I live, he would call and ask how I was and inquired if I was affected in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes I did not even know or even heard about what had happened. Some years ago, my son was hospitalized in the University Hospital of the West Indies. And when it came to Mr. Dean's knowledge, his concern grew, and he admonished me for not informing him so that he could ask his daughter, Dr. Jacqueline Minot, to look out for him. He felt better when I told him that my niece was employed at that hospital as well. So my son had someone his back. Mr. Deans had a family life, and he had a wonderful family. He spoke fondly of his caring wife, whom I met a few years ago when Mrs. Cook and I visited him at his home. He boasts of their years of togetherness. He really loved and cherished his wife. He was very proud of all his children, his 3 daughters, Cheryl, Bridget, Jacqueline, and his one and only son, Michael. And while I was at his Thanksgiving service on Saturday, his son read the eulogy, and he said when he was born, Mr. Deans having 3 girls before, and the 3 girls were at Immaculate. When he dropped them off the morning after he was born, he took him out of the car and he said, "I have a son! I have a son!" He was so proud of Michael. He spoke also of their spouses, and when the grandchildren came along, he spoke of them with pride. Just the other day, he told me that he was afraid of his grandchildren growing up in today's world. And I told him to pray for them and ask God to lead them. When his wife passed, also not long ago, he mourned her loss until his death. He told me earlier this year that she was not interred as yet. And I was wondering what he was saying until his son Michael told me 2 weeks ago that she was cremated and the urn was there waiting and would be placed to rest with Mr. Dean's urn, as he would also be cremated. Mr. Deans loved cricket and spoke about it all the time and went to watch many a cricket being played. However, first on his list of speeches was parliamentary practice and procedure. He also had a great love for dominoes and had an employee of this august body. Rest well, Mr. Deans. Sleep on and take your rest. I will see you again when I am also ushered into the place that Jesus promised to prepare for people like you and me. Thank you.
Procedures on a program done by RGR that gives you almost a blow-by-blow description of what is happening in Parliament. And the parliamentarians, both the senators and members of the House of Representatives, you would hear of them. But then you would hear of Mr. Deans being a clerk of the House. And when the reporters report on an institutional member of the House, you know that that member would be doing something right. Mr. Deans would be what you would call a consummate public servant, who have served so long. 1956, coming in as the assistant clerk, then moving to deputy clerk, then moving up to serving as clerk of the House of Parliament. Now, when I listen to Mrs. Curtis, you would understand the role that Hedley Dean played in the House of Parliament by being a leader, a teacher, a consummate public servant, for sticking to the task of serving in the public service. Someone you can describe as having an eye on the prize, not staying in one role, progressing to another, and then getting to being the clerk of the House of Parliament. That there's no question about dedication and loyalty that was demonstrated by Hedley Deans. And I believe in his passing, he must be commended for that. The other thing that I picked up is that not only was he a consummate public servant, but also a mentor. And that's important, to mentor the other members of staff. And those of us who are going through the standing orders can understand and appreciate the work that he would have done to lay the foundation to what is being depicted today. And so, President, I use the opportunity for us to recognize public servants who have served and have served well. Hedley Deans was one such person, and we commend him for that. Also, based on what Mrs. Curtis would have indicated, you know, today we talk about work-life balance. Well, he demonstrated the art of work-life balance, to be doing this awesome work, but find the time to play domino and cricket. Awesome. That is work-life balance. Yep. And he had demonstrated at a time when we didn't even know about it. So, I want to commend him for the work that he has done and hope that he will always, and
I won't repeat all the factual matters and the the praise that has been showered on Mr. Dean's former clerk. However, as myself and Senator Motley are perhaps the only other two members of the Senate other than yourself who had the privilege of serving while Mr. Deans was clerk, I just would like to add a few words. It is, I think, of great interest to note that he's perhaps the only non-attorney to serve as clerk to our Houses of Parliament. And the fact that he, notwithstanding that, was such an authority on parliamentary practice and procedures tells you how dedicated he was to the position. I have had the additional privilege of, when I was minister, working with his son, who served in the military at that time. So there's two generations of deans as public servants that I've had the privilege of working with. And when I reached out to him to express condolences to himself and the family. It was interesting that he shared that for a man like his father, who had served so long and so well this country, his perhaps greatest pride was that he had served with impartiality all the various administrations. And really he, to my mind, was the epitome of that impartial civil service and that impartial public service that is represented in the Westminster system of government. He perhaps loved his family first and his country second, but Parliament was a close third. He really made this his life and his work, his public service. And I think we all are better off today for the decades of service that he gave to this institution. And I think we appropriately honor his memory here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the members to rise for a moment of silence. May his soul rest in peace and light perpetual shine upon him. Thank you. Madam Clerk, just to ask that the Hansard of the proceedings this morning be sent to Mr. Deans' family with the appropriate notification that we did honor him this morning. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following: Ministry Paper number 76 of 2022 and Annual Report of the Office of the Utilities Regulation for the year 2021-2022. Report of the deliberations of the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on the bill shortly entitled the Customs Act 2022. The Integrity Commission Special Report of Investigation conducted in the circumstances surrounding the award of contract of Knightsman Security Limited for the provision of security services at the downtown Kingston Transportation Center for the period 2010 to 2011, and Annual Report of the Jamaica Business Development Corporation for the year 2019-2020.
Thank you, Madam. Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the Senate, I'll move to introduce and have read first time a bill shortly entitled the Special Economic Zones Amendment Act 2022.
Thank you, Minister Hill. Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. the presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public Business Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will be taking the Firearms Prohibition, Restriction and Regulation Act. I would have loved to have said through all its stages, but I understand there is an agreement in place to extend till tomorrow. But it is my hope.
Sorry, Minister, your technical staff are not.
They're here and they'll come in now. They're watching. I think they were completing some matters. So, but we will try and take it as far as it can go. There. So, Mr. President, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the second reading of a bill entitled the Firearms Prohibition, Restriction and Regulation Act 2022 and to take it through all its concluding stages, expected to be extended till tomorrow.
Members would have heard the question.
Mr. President, I'm extremely pleased to open this morning's debate on the Firearms Prohibition, Restriction and Regulation Bill 2022, which is an act to repeal and replace the Firearms Act to provide more particularly for the prohibition, restriction, or regulation as may be appropriate of firearms and ammunition and for connected matters. This bill has benefited from a relay of sorts of attention from ministers, from technical staff, and because of the consequential nature of it, many persons have had the opportunity to work and contribute to this very important piece of legislation. This Honourable Senate may recall that the bill which was tabled in these chambers on Friday, September 9th, 2022, was approved in the House of Representatives with no amendments, but several interventions by members of Parliament, some of which were addressed by Portfolio Minister DPM Chang. I will also speak to these in my brief remarks this morning as we debate this important piece of legislation in our arsenal for the fight against crime and criminal elements in our society. Mr. President, research has shown that armed violence in the Latin American and Caribbean region surpasses that of all other regions. Despite having less than 1% of the world's population, the LAC accounts for approximately 23% of all recorded homicides, with an average homicide rate of 15.1 per 100,000 people. Mr. President, this 15.1 is nearly 3 times the world average. Moreover, firearms are used in approximately 70% of homicides across the region. In comparison, on average, firearms are used in approximately 30% of homicides at the global level. This according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Mr. President, the local situation is dire and has been dire for decades. Minister Chang in his presentation highlighted some statistics that I believe are worth repeating here to provide some context for our discussion, both for the young men and women who have joined us for Pembroke Hall and from those who have joined us digitally. Over time, the proliferation of an increased access to illegal firearms have had a debilitating and disruptive impact on the social and economic development of the country. Over the last 25 years, Jamaica has recorded an average of 1,270 murders annually, with the vast majority committed with the use of a gun. That has left us at times with our murder rate being 3 times the regional average in a region that is 3 times the world average. Currently, and not recently, so currently is a broad concept, the situation that we face has been at crisis proportions and is considered and has been considered a clear and present threat to the public safety and security of the country. The crime statistics show that last year in 2021, 85% of total murders and 80% of all robberies committed nationally involved the use of a firearm. This trend has continued into this year, and as year-to-date statistics indicate that since the start of the year and up to August 27th, 842 or 85% of the 996 murders recorded nationally were carried out with the use of a gun. Additionally, the firearm was featured in 470 or 79% of the 598 recorded robberies, which represents a marked increase from, say, 4 years ago, when the gun featured in approximately 72% of robberies. Further assessment of the crime data reveals so far this year that approximately 77% of murders for which a context has been established were gang-related. This demonstrates a strong propensity by a segment of the society, particularly gang members, to use illegal firearms to commit acts of crime and violence. This has resulted in Jamaica being consistently ranked among the top countries in the world with the highest murder rates. Mr. President, the increased production of cocaine in South America and the proliferation of lottery scamming activities across the island have led to the dramatic increase of trafficking of firearms and ammunition. These firearms can be obtained in the United States of America, Haiti, Central America, and indeed South America. The illegal firearms that are the scourge of this country are not only coming through official air and sea ports, but also through the 145 unofficial ports of entry spread across the island. Colleagues should remember that our special economic zone is 24 times our landmass. The firearms smuggled through our official ports are usually concealed among cargo shipments of household items, personal items, vehicle components, and machinery. Traffickers in Jamaica and criminal gangs in Haiti often engage in the exchange of marijuana for guns, and increasingly there is also the trading of meat from stolen animals for firearms. The result of this is that more guns are available to a wide cross-section of the criminal underworld, facilitated by the huge amount of money generated by their illicit activities. Therefore, the random use of firearms in killings and shootings has increased. Now, we should not diminish the fact that the very blessing we have with our geographic location is indeed the curse. The reason we are so primed as a country for logistics investment and for shipping is because of our location. It is the reason why traffickers from Central America, South America, and indeed other parts of the Caribbean find our waterways so appealing for trafficking activities. It is crucial, therefore, Mr. President, that our legislative framework seeks to address the scale and complexity of these issues. Mr. President, given the proliferation of illegal firearms in this country, it is not surprising that the security forces have seen a steady rate of firearm recovery over the years. Since 2018, Mr. President, the security forces have seized more than 3,200 illegal firearms and in excess of 53,000 rounds of ammunition. In fact, approximately 625 firearms are seized by the security forces on an annual basis. As of August 27th of this year, a total of 508 firearms have been seized, and that represented an increase of 11% over the year-to-date figure of 2021. Mr. President, it is important for colleagues to note, and for all listening or watching through whichever mechanism, understand that the bill being tabled today makes a clear distinction between activities that are prohibited under all circumstances and those that will be regulated. As a consequence, the legislation are contained in a separate part of the bill. Additionally, the report related to the Joint Select Committee. The truth is, Mr. President, Mandatory minimum sentencing or mandatory sentencing ensures adequate retribution for offending conduct. Retribution is based on the principle that those who engage in criminal activity and harm others deserve to suffer. A democratically elected parliament represents public opinion, and in this case, public opinion about crime and appropriate sentencing. Mandatory sentencing schemes developed by Parliament reassure victims of crime that the offender will face appropriate retribution. As DPM Chang noted in his presentation to the House, there will be recourse under the Criminal Justice Administration Act for those who may wish to appeal the mandatory sentence handed down. But let each case turn on its own merit. This bill, Mr. President, also addresses the chronic issue that we have faced since the middle of the 1990s. We have had a murder rate perpetrated with the gun for most of my lifetime, which is at epidemic proportions. The legislative framework that we have put in place as a parliament, or have left in place for the length of my lifetime, has proven to be inadequate. In recent years, across political administrations, there have been changes to that legislative framework. But the suite of legislation that is required is not yet complete. I've given credit for the known anti-gang legislation and for the DNA legislation. Those are appropriate for the situation we face with gangs and for the chronic situation that we were facing with sexual offenses, certainly leading up to that legislation. The records will show that the operationalization and the investment behind the technical expertise for our DNA lab, which has moved it to having equipment and staffing which is in line with best practice and the best standards in the world, has functioned to facilitate a reduction in those crimes because you've been able to get convictions because of how solid the evidence is. But if one notes the length of time that persons spend in prison on average for gun crime versus the average for the crimes that you've been able to bring in line with regional standards is vastly different. Mr. President, I was a member of the Joint Select Committee, but certainly had a change of portfolio midway in that space, but wish to acknowledge and commend the work of the committee and the robust discussions that took place among our colleagues. I wish to also put on record, Mr. President, my commendations for the technical teams that have worked for years, first to bring it to the Joint Select Committee, and through that Joint Select Committee to evaluate and provide clarification based on the submissions that would have come in from many sectors of society. Mr. President, I will now take the Senate through a clause-by-clause analysis of the bill, which is divided into 10 parts. I'd like to just bring to your attention, as we said, we will circulate before the end of the day the amendment sheet, but just to put on record the ones that you're to look out for. Clause 2, 5, and 15, along with the 7th schedule. So, yes, we will circulate the sheet, but just want colleagues as I go through the 2, 5, 15, and the 7th schedule, President. Sorry, and clause 101 as well, to President. And so, clause 2, clause 5, clause 15, clause 101, and the 7th schedule. There is also an expected amendment to other sections as it relates specifically to the issue of approvals for dealers and brokers. But we will come to that in time. Mr. President, Part 1 of the bill deals with preliminaries, clauses 1 to 4. It has a short title and commencement, the interpretation, the objects of the Act, and a qualification as to the application of Parts 2 and 4 of the Act. Currently, Mr. President, it is noted that at Clause 1(2), different days may be appointed under Section 1 in respect of different provisions of this Act. This is to account for the fact that several new provisions relating to the marking of firearms in Clause 29, the establishment of a new firearms register at Clause 88, will require the acquisition of new equipment and/or establishment of systems and structures for effective implementation. Clause 2 of the bill sets out key concepts and terms used throughout the bill and include new and amended definitions. Ammunition means any article consisting of a complete cartridge or round, or any component of a cartridge or round, and includes any cartridge case, primer, propellant, or bullet or projectile that can be used in a firearm. Brokering, and I made this point because it won't affect the definition, but it will affect where it is mentioned elsewhere in the bill, includes the exporting, importing, financing, mediating, purchasing, selling, transferring, transporting, freight forwarding, supplying, and delivering of firearms or ammunition of such type and at such place as may be specified in a firearm broker's license. Firearm A means any barreled weapon which discharges or is designed to discharge any shot, bullet, or other projectile, or 2, prohibited weapon, unless the context otherwise requires and includes any such weapons created as 3D printed weapons or otherwise created through the use of electronic software. B includes any parts and components of any weapon referred to in paragraph A, and C does not include an air rifle, air gun, or air pistol of a type caliber prescribed by the minister. This definition is a new definition which takes into consideration advances in technology and moving with the current risks and movements in firearms production. Modification in relation to firearms or ammunition. A means any act that results in a difference in appearance, function, or performance of the firearm or ammunition. B includes alteration and effecting repairs, and C does not include changing the choke on a shotgun. Parts and components means any items or replacement items specifically designed for a firearm and essential to its operation, and includes a barrel, frame, or to diminish the sound caused by firing a firearm. Prohibited firearms, Mr. President, refer to any artillery, any automatic firearm, any rifle of a prescribed caliber, any light machine gun or heavy machine gun, any submachine gun, any firearm in respect of which no firearm authorization is granted at Part 5, and that's particularly important, Mr. President, any other type of firearm prescribed by the minister, or any parts or components of any item referred to in any of the paragraphs A to G. Prohibited weapons, Mr. President, includes A, any prohibited firearm, any grenade, bomb, or other like missile, any missile or missile launcher, any projectile or rocket manufactured to be discharged from any item referred to in any of the paragraphs B and C. E, any imitation of any weapon or device referred to in any of the paragraphs A to D. F, any ammunition stockpiled in the quantity referred to in section 2B or in a person's possession in the quantity referred to in sections 10(2)(b)(2). Any other such weapons or devices as may be prescribed by the minister, or H, any parts and components of an item referred to in any of paragraphs B to G. 3D firearms, Mr. President, means a barreled weapon which discharges or is designed to discharge any shot, bullet, or other projectile that is mostly produced or manufactured with a 3D printer or any type of electronic software. Traffic in relation to any firearm, ammunition, prohibited weapon, or other categories of conventional arms means the import, export, transit, transshipment, brokering, acquisition, sale, delivery, movement, or transfer of the firearm, ammunition, prohibited weapon, or other categories of conventional arms, whether within Jamaica or across Jamaica's borders. Mr. President, the inclusion of some of these definitions should facilitate effective prosecution of firearm-related offences. Clause 3 of the bill outlines the objectives which speaks to establishing a framework which prohibits firearms and ammunition that are illicitly traded, which regards possession of those prohibited firearms and ammunition as a foundation on which other heinous and violent crimes are committed, and to provide distinct from that framework a regime for the regulation of firearms and ammunition that are lawfully acquired and duly registered. Mr. President, Clause 4 states that unless otherwise specifically provided for in this Act, Part 2 shall not apply to any firearms or ammunition regulated under Part 4, and provisions of Part 4 shall not apply in respect of prohibited weapons. This is important as the penalty regime for offences related to the prohibited firearms are significantly more stringent than those related to the regulated regime. Recall in my introductory remarks, Mr. President, I outlined the makeup of the bill and the rationale for the separation of regimes wherein more stringent penalties are presented for firearms which have never been a part of the regulatory framework. In this regard, Part 2 of the bill, Clauses 5 to 19, outlines prohibitions in respect of firearms and ammunition and makes specific reference to the activities that are strictly prohibited, such as possession simpliciter, stockpiling, manufacturing, trafficking, diversion, and dealing in a prohibited weapon, among others. Mr. President, because of the nature of these penalties, I shall explain in detail the rationale for each provision in Part 2 of the bill and the penalty provision attached. Clause 5, Mr. President, speaks to the possession simpliciter of a prohibited weapon as defined. The Act provides that no person shall possess a prohibited weapon, and any person who contravenes this section commits a felony and shall on conviction be sentenced to imprisonment for life and a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years before being eligible for parole. Mr. President, the rationale for the penalty provision lies in the statistics. As noted earlier, a review of the data for the current year, certainly as at August 20, some 962 and now past 1,000 murders have been recorded, 85% of which with the firearm, illegal, and in this case would be prohibited firearms. It is clear, Mr. President, that prohibited weapons, as defined in this bill, pose the greatest danger to national security and public safety. Accordingly, stringent penalties are attached to offences involving the possession or use of a prohibited weapon and attract mandatory sentences of imprisonment. This penalty regime, Mr. President, should be sufficiently punitive to match the seriousness of the crime of possession simpliciter. Clause 6 of the bill deals with the stockpiling and makes it an offence for any person to be in the possession of or cause to accumulate 3 or more prohibited weapons or 50 or more rounds of ammunition. The penalty provision is imprisonment for life, and the mandatory minimum term of imprisonment in this case, Mr. President, is 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. Stockpiling a weapon outside the framework of an authorization is a threat to the state and is more egregious for the stockpiling of prohibited weapons. Stockpiled weapons pose a risk to public safety, a security threat to the society, and ultimately a challenge to the state's monopoly on the use of force. Consequently, the introduction of harsher penalties than those present in the Act for offences such as stockpiling aims to strengthen the capability of law enforcement to tackle the present issues facing the country. Clause 7 introduces the offence of trafficking in prohibited weapons and criminalizes a person who ships, brokers, acquires, sells, delivers, moves, or transfers prohibited weapons from or within Jamaica or across Jamaica's borders. The penalty for trafficking is imprisonment for life, with a mandatory term imprisonment of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. Mr. President, the trafficking of firearms across the region has had a significant impact on the wave of crime in Jamaica. Firearms trafficking often takes place to satisfy demand from criminals who require arms for use in various unlawful activities. With the absence of the offense of trafficking in the current legislation, there has been a significant gap to curb this offense. Furthermore, as the country strives to satisfy our international obligations under the Firearms Protocol and the Arms Trade Treaty, the introduction of trafficking will no doubt aid prosecution of these merchants of death. Clause 8 criminalizes possession of a prohibited weapon with intent to traffic and provides for a penalty of imprisonment for life with a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. The introduction of this provision is relevant where the prosecution can prove the knowledge component of possession for the purpose of trafficking by showing an individual either had actual knowledge of the offense or that the individual was willfully blind to the presence of the firearm. The offense of manufacture of prohibited weapons or possession of device, therefore, is outlined at Clause 9 and provides a penalty of imprisonment for life with a mandatory term of imprisonment of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. This provision goes further to state at subclause 3 that no person shall possess A, a digital blueprint of a prohibited firearm weapon, or B, a digital blueprint of any device with the intent to manufacture a 3D printed firearm that is a prohibited weapon. A person who contravenes subsection 3 commits a felony and shall be sentenced to imprisonment for life with a mandatory term of imprisonment of 10 years before becoming eligible for parole. Clause 10, Mr. President, prohibits dealing in prohibited weapons and sets out the circumstances for dealing wherein if a person buys or sells any prohibited weapon or conducts any brokering in respect of prohibited weapons or is in possession of 2 or more prohibited weapons or 20 or more rounds of ammunition, that person commits an offense and is liable on conviction to imprisonment for life and a mandatory term of imprisonment of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole. Mr. President, Clause 11 prohibits the taking of firearms or ammunition in pawn and applies to firearms and ammunition that are prohibited weapons and firearms and ammunition regulated under Part 4. A person who contravenes this provision, Mr. President, commits a felony and is liable to conviction before a circuit court to a fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 15 years. Clause 12, Mr. President, introduces the offense of diversion and criminalizes any person in Jamaica or a Jamaican citizen outside of Jamaica who is involved, whether directly or indirectly, in any activity that results in the movement of any firearms, ammunition, or other category of conventional arms from a person who is authorized to possess, use, or traffic such firearm, ammunition, or other category of conventional arms to the illicit market to a person who is not authorized to possess, use, or traffic from the illicit market. The diversion of firearms is a key international security concern, as unregulated weapons can perpetuate and exacerbate conflict and armed violence to contribute to insecurity and instability. The prevention of diversion is a significant element in the Arms Trade Treaty, which establishes common international standards to ensure greater responsibility and transparency in the global arms trade. A person who commits the offense of diversion is liable upon conviction before a circuit court to a term of imprisonment of not less than 15 years nor more than 25 years. Mr. President, Clause 13 deals with the provision on prohibition on alteration of ballistic signature, conversion of firearm, and prohibited weapon. Mr. President, no person shall A, do anything to a firearm which alters the ballistic signature of the firearm, B, convert into a firearm anything which is not a firearm, and convert into a prohibited weapon anything which is not a prohibited weapon. The application penalties at clause 13.2 and 13.4 for these offences should serve as a deterrent for persons who are minded to conduct these prohibited activities. This Honourable Senate is asked to note that as a part of this country's obligations under the Firearms Protocol, Jamaica is mandated to take necessary measures to prevent the illicit manufacture and trafficking of firearms and ammunition. Therefore, absence of manufacture marks that are placed on a firearm at the point of manufacture would be indicative of illicit manufacturing. Firearms that are manufactured without manufacture marks, in particular serial numbers, are described as ghost guns and have posed a significant challenge to international tracking and tracing efforts. Mr. President, Clause 14 provides that no person shall use or attempt to use a firearm or imitation firearm with the intention to commit or aid the commission of a felony, or to resist or preventing the lawful apprehension or detention of himself or some other person. The penalty provided for in 14.4 is term of imprisonment of not less than 20 years nor more than 25 years. This section, Mr. President, makes a link to several pieces of legislation outlined in the first schedule in accordance with section 14.3. A person who, at the time of committing, or B, at the time when that person is apprehended for any offence specified in the first schedule, has in that person's possession a firearm or imitation firearm, commits a felony. We thought it important to retain this provision for all those criminals and want to be criminals out there, to recognize that brandishing a firearm will extend to other offences that are not expressed within this law. It is a message that any form of intimidation will not be tolerated. This section applies to prohibited weapons and to firearms regulated under Part 4 of the Act. Clause 15 deals with possession of firearms or ammunition with intent to injure, cause damage, and criminalize a person who is in possession of any firearm or ammunition, whose intention is to injure any person or cause serious damage to property, or by enabling any other person to injure a person or cause serious damage. The penalty for 15.2 is imprisonment for such terms not less than 15 years nor more than 25 years, and also applies to firearms and ammunition regulated under Part 4. I'll remind colleagues that this is a clause that an amendment will come for in the sheet shortly. Clause 15. And I should have done so similarly for 2 and 5, but just to remind colleagues that you stay focused on those clauses as is presented. I do, but I prefer to circulate the final one. They're completed now. Yeah, man. Dana is able support, so I have no fear. Clause 16 is the one that no person shall remove, alter, modify, or in any other manner tamper with any mark referred to in section 29, whether in relation to firearms regulated under Part 4 or any other firearm. The penalty is a fine of $5 million or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 5 years in the parish court, or a fine and imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years in the circuit court. Mr. President, it is vital for firearms to be marked with the information that is essential for tracking and verifying the history and movements of the firearm itself. This prevents the latter from leaving the official system and entering the black market. Also, there are international regulations governing the production of firearms, including the marking activity. It must be understood that any person who knowingly removes a mark will be doing so with nefarious intent, as these firearms are impossible to trace and can affect meaningful forensic investigations. Clause 17 criminalizes a person who transfers firearms, ammunition, other categories of conventional arms, or any prohibited weapons if the transfers are in violation of any resolution of the United Nations Security Council under Charter 7 of the United Nations Charter, in particular in relation to arms embargoes. Chapter 7 allows the Council to determine the existence of any threat, breach of the peace, or act of aggression to take military or non-military action to restore international peace and security. The breach of any decision by the United Nations Security Council is considered a serious offense, which may result in sanctions. Additionally, the Arms Trade Treaty mandates that states take measures to prevent transfer of conventional arms in violation of a decision of the UNSC. As such, the penalty is a term of imprisonment not exceeding 20 years. In accordance with Section 17.3, the section applies to acts committed A, by a person in Jamaica, or B, outside of Jamaica by a Jamaican citizen or a company incorporated in Jamaica. Weapons to the state without. This amnesty may be declared upon the minister being satisfied that it may result in the reduction of the number of illegally possessed firearms or ammunition in the country. Mr. President, firearms amnesties have been used. Possession of a prohibited weapon have the opportunity to not interact with the consequences of a breach of this bill. That means that those who do not want is that the prospect of life in prison will be sufficient for persons to want to take advantage of this, and will be sufficient to pass a threshold that ample opportunity is provided to those who don't have the intention to murder and maim our citizens. But those who do not take advantage would obviously display such intention, and we would encourage the police to move with alacrity to continue the removal of these firearms and persons. Part 3 of the bill, Mr. President, which stretches or spans rather from clauses 20 to 26, outlines the provisions in respect of the Firearms Licensing Authority. And colleagues, I can focus on every clause, or I can focus on particular sections. But I think, especially based on the work of the Joint Select Committee, I won't necessarily need to go through each clause. But I will focus on the work of the Firearms Licensing Authority, and after that I'll take the sections kind of en masse in that space. A fund is also challenged in effectively carrying out its daily business operations and functions of the CEO, who shall be responsible for day-to-day management and operations of the authority. Part 5 of the bill sets out the restrictions, which is clause 27 to 55, sets out the restrictions in respect of firearms and ammunition. This portion of the bill, Mr. President, would govern what are the restricted activities principally related to firearms that are a part of the regulated framework. I will now highlight some of the brand new and important inclusions in this framework. Clause 28 sets out a requirement for the minister to prescribe our national firearms control system and firearm control list. This provision, while administrative, is an important step towards Jamaica achieving its international obligation under the Firearms Trade Treaty. Some water, please. Some water. The requirement for all firearms to be marked is included at clause 29. With the introduction of this provision, a firearm imported into, exported from, transited or transshipped through or manufactured in Jamaica must bear the mark of a manufacturer and include the country of manufacture, name of manufacturer, date of manufacture, serial number, type, make, and model, as well as the caliber of the firearm. This new provision also satisfies Jamaica's obligations, international obligations under the Firearms Protocol. Mr. President, it is vital for firearms to be marked with information that is essential for tracing and verifying the history and movements of firearms itself. This prevents the firearms from leaving the official system and entering the black market. Clause 30, Mr. President, prescribes under what conditions...
Just before you start on Clause 30, Speaker's time has expired. Senator Bunting.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm proposing that the Minister's time be extended sufficiently to complete his presentation.
Senator Bunting, you would have heard the question. Those in favour? Against? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr.
Minister.
President, and thank you, colleague, for the motion. Clause 30, Mr. President, prescribes under what conditions an addition or modification of a mark may occur, notwithstanding the prohibition in Section 16. The addition or modification of a mark on a firearm may only be done to correct evident errors to facilitate the deployment of government-owned firearms or during the course of an investigation for evidentiary purposes. Clause 31 sets out the responsibility of capturing of ballistic signatures and information in relation to the firearms. In accordance with 31.1, the Institute is responsible for capturing ballistic signatures for firearms, the property of the government, of Jamaica, and the authority for privately owned firearms as set out at 31.2. And capturing of ballistic signatures plays an important role in criminal investigations. At the end of the day, every firearm tells a story. The information required to depict their story can be obtained from both the exterior and interior of a firearm. 33 sets out the restriction on trafficking in firearms and ammunition without the appropriate authorization. The provision prohibits persons knowingly trafficking any firearms, ammunition, or other category of conventional arms into and out of Jamaica, or through or across Jamaica or to another country, without the appropriate firearms authorization to do so pursuant to this bill. A penalty of imprisonment for life with a mandatory term of imprisonment of 15 years becoming eligible for parole, or 15 years before becoming eligible for parole, is established under this provision. Clause 40 outlines the restriction in dealing in firearms and ammunition. The provision highlights the circumstance being the owner, occupier, or person in charge of any premises, receptacle or conveyance, use of the premises, receptacle or conveyance for I, the manufacturing or storage of any firearm or ammunition, or 2, trafficking in any firearm or ammunition or knowingly permit such premises, receptacle or conveyance to be so used, or B, provide financial or any other type of support to facilitate activity listed in paragraph A, 1 or 2. A person who contravenes subsection 4 commits a felony and shall on conviction on indictment before a circuit court be imprisoned for life. Mr. President, Section 45 sets out that no person shall be in possession of a firearm or ammunition without the appropriate firearm authorization granted under Part 5 of the Act. A person who contravenes this provision is liable on conviction before a parish court to a fine not exceeding $5 million or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 5 years, and in the circuit court to imprisonment for life. The bill establishes also at 45.3 that any firearm or ammunition carried in parts by 2 or more persons in company, each person shall be deemed to be in possession of a firearm or ammunition. This will deal with organized groups who act in concert by carrying firearms and ammunition in parts, further strengthening what we seek to achieve in the anti-gang legislation. It is important to note that Clause 46 outlines circumstances under which an individual would not be deemed to be in unauthorized possession of a firearm, which includes such firearm or ammunition is the property of the government of Jamaica and the person is authorized to be in possession. Also, if the person is a personal representative of the estate of a deceased person and that deceased person is held a firearm authorization, or if the person came into possession in the capacity as an auctioneer, bailiff, or assistant bailiff of the court. I will move to Part 5 of the bill, which is clauses 56 to 72. This outlines the provisions in respect of the firearm authorizations granted under the Act. It also treats with the obligations of the holder of a firearm authorization and the circumstances for suspension, revocation, cancellation of firearm authorizations. Mr. President, the bill before us has expanded the licensing regime to ensure that the framework aligns with the evolving firearm industry and current realities. In this regard, the bill includes several new authorizations that will be granted whether by the authority or by the minister. These include A, a firearm broker's license, B, a firearms user's business license, C, a firearm shooting range license, D, a gun license, E, a firearm trainer's license, F, an antique firearm collector's license, G, firearm range operator's license, H, firearm user's secondary certificate, I, a firearm user's special certificate, and J, a firearm user's permit for minors. Mr. President, this part of the bill being part 5, there are no contemplations for amendments at this stage. Part 6 of the bill sets out the procedures for appeals. Clause 86 establishes appeals review panel, and the 5th schedule details the constitution and the matters relating to procedures of the panel. This review panel places the review board in the current act. In accordance with 86.1, an appeal may be made to the review panel within the prescribed time and in the prescribed manner by a person aggrieved by a decision of the board, granting or refusing to grant a firearm authorization other than a firearm manufacturer's license, and B, amending or refusing to amend a firearm authorization, C, suspending or refusing to suspend a firearm authorization, and D, revoking or refusing to revoke a firearms authorization. Clause 87 provides that upon appeal being received, the review panel shall, after hearing the parties in the appeal, either confirm the decision of the board or refer the matter back to the board for a fresh decision to be made or make such other decision. It is important to note here, Mr. President, that the minister no longer has a role in the review, rather in the appeal process. Part 7 of the bill, which refers to clauses 88 and 89, outlines the provisions relating to the establishment of a national firearms register. In accordance with 88.1, the director of the institute, being IFLSM, shall, as soon as practicable, after the earliest appointed day under Section 1, establish, maintain, and operate in accordance with this Act for and on behalf of the government of Jamaica, a data bank to be known as the National Firearms Registry. The Firearms Register will be the central repository or data bank for the storage of records information for government and civilian firearms and ammunition in Jamaica. The Firearms Register is aimed at inter alia facilitating access to data to assist criminal investigations, executive decisions in the interest of national security and research. The register will maintain records related to all firearm authorizations to include firearm ownership, firearm marks, and ballistic profile and import, export, and transit and transshipment permits. The information in the register will not be available to the public. In addition, the registrar may provide reports to the authority, the court, a law enforcement agency, or the central authority being the DPP, pursuant to an approved request under the Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Act. Part 8 refers to clauses 90 and 96, sets out the powers of search, seizure, and to obtain information. Clause 95 outlines the circumstances under which firearms and ammunition may be retained, for example, where a person is arrested for an offense under the Act. Clause 96 outlines the forfeiture procedure in respect of firearms and ammunition. Part 9, clauses 97 to 102, and just to remind colleagues that at 101, there is a draft amendment, and I'll share this section with you because I believe this section is fine. If you could pass this to Senator Bunting for me. Clause 97 to 102 deals with the provision in respect of offences. Several new provisions included are at 97, which establishes a fixed penalty regime. This provides for the authority to serve a person with fixed penalty notice if the authority has reason to believe that the person committed an offence to which the section applies. These offences are limited to Section 77.2, where failure to display a license as required or Section 78 contravenes the terms and conditions of firearm authorizations of any other offense prescribed under Section 10, subsection 10 rather. Clause 98 provides for the utilization of controlled delivery, which is allowing for illicit or suspect consignments of firearm ammunition, prohibited weapons, or other related materials or substances substituted for them to pass through or into Jamaica with the knowledge or under the supervision of a competent authority with a view to identifying persons involved in the commission of any offense under the Act. This provision, Mr. President, it is believed should aid in the successful prosecution of firearm trafficking offenses. It is noted that in accordance with Section 98(2), that evidence obtained by a competent authority through a controlled delivery operation shall be admissible in evidence in proceeding for an offense under the Act. Clause 99 outlines, under the circumstances that may be regarded in determining fines and sentences included, whether an offender has been previously convicted of a firearm-related offense, or whether the offender is convicted in connection with the commission of an offense under the Act in an area declared an ZOSO or an SOE. Clause 102 provides that a person who assaults, obstructs, hinders, or resists, uses any threatening language to an authorized officer executing any function under this Act commits an offense shall be liable on summary conviction, therefore before a parish court, to a fine not exceeding $1 million or on default of payment to that fine to imprisonment of a term not exceeding 1 year. Part 10, now clause 103 to 117, has the miscellaneous provisions and speaks to, for example, a new power of the authority to auction firearms or ammunition, which is at clause 103. Clause 117, Mr. President, provides the consequential amendments to other pieces of legislation set out in the 7th schedule, which will take place pursuant to the enactment of this legislation. These include amendment to Section 42C of the Criminal Justice Amendment Act, will include specific reference to a prohibited offense under the Firearms Act, whereby offenses concerning prohibited weapons and prohibited activities should not be automatically reduced by virtue of a guilty plea. Pursuant to the consequential amendment to Section 42C of the Criminal Justice Act, offenses under Part 2 of the bill would now be included in that section. Consequently, where an offender pleads guilty to an offense listed under Part 2 of the bill, they will not benefit from a plea agreement in furtherance of a reduced sentence. Notwithstanding the foregoing amendments in Section 42K(1) of the Criminal Justice Administration Act makes allowances for cases in which sentencing judge, who having regard to the particular circumstances of a case and opines that it would be manifestly excessive and unjust to sentence the offender to the prescribed minimum sentence under Part 2 of the bill, may issue a certificate to the offender so as to allow him or her to seek leave to appeal from a judge of the Court of Appeal against the sentence. Notwithstanding the punitive regime being enforced, there is still an avenue for leave to appeal the process. Section 5 of the Criminal Justice Plea Negotiations and Agreements Act will provide for the imposition of a lesser sentence only in an instance where the accused provides information that may assist the Crown in the prevention, detection, or investigation of, or in proceedings related to firearms offenses or any other offense. This will encourage offenders to provide critical information to support the state in tackling the proliferation of illicit firearms and other transnational organized criminal activities. The consequential amendments made to the Offences Against the Persons Act will increase penalty provisions for sections 13, 16, 17 by including a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years for offences involving the use of a firearm. In addition, under section 22, the mandatory sentence has been increased from 15 years to 20 years in keeping with the proposed penalty regime of the current bill. Amendment to Section 2 of the Gun Court Act to account for the new definition of firearm as outlined under the current bill. In addition, a new definition will be introduced for firearm offences, which will include any offence under the bill, other than offence in relation to confidentiality at Clause 105, or any other offence involving a firearm in which the offender's possession, therefore, is contrary to the provisions of the bill treating with unauthorized possession at Clause 45. Mr. President, I look forward to the contributions of colleagues, and I look forward ultimately to the support of both sides of the aisle. This bill is long in coming. I recall the last contribution I made to a debate in December of 2021 while I was still assigned at the Ministry of National Security related to the Corrections Act, which, by the way, has cases before the court now in relation to the stipulations out there. But I made the point, and I told the story of a tour that we did in the southernmost section of MP Anthony Hilton's constituency, where a young girl was murdered in her bed by marauding gangsters exchanging gunfire. Now, I didn't see the final crime scene report, but while I was touring that facility, or the incident of that crime, Mr. President, they had already found, while they were still processing, over 50 spent shells. At some point, and the residents would tell you that they heard the men on one side, certainly that was closer to the home, saying, you hear that? Send back two more over there. There can be no illusion, no argument that the problem of firearms is a chronic one. Can be no illusion that the possession of firearms is the problem. You can't use it if you don't possess it. Mr. President, I'll never forget the experiences I would have had and the information that I'd have been privy to at the Ministry of National Security. This bill and what it does by way of the penalties should have been passed in 1999 based on the statistical tipping point that we would have hit then. This bill and the penalties that it prescribes for possession, to my mind, are 23 years late. And I hope that we will not just pass this bill, but support it loudly, because the situation that we face, and not just face today, and I'm going to make that point, that have faced certainly for the extent of the 38 years of my life, demands this. It demands more, it demands other pieces of legislation that are to come. And it demands our support as legislators. As this, I mean, there's so many documents that have spoken about the GDP impact of crime. But all of us as politicians, we speak about our being on the ground. There's nothing more painful to the constituencies and the Jamaican public than the impact of gun-related crime. As such, Mr. President, I look forward to contributions of colleagues. I thank you.
Minister, before I call on Senator Bunting, it would be remiss of me not to highlight how pellucid your presentation was. Senator Bunting, no doubt you remember that word.
Very much so. Very much so, Mr. Before going to my prepared remarks, let me say I welcome not just the bill, but the amendments that Minister Samuda spoke to. Although we are at a disadvantage, as most of the amendments, the debate has started and we don't have a draft of them. And even in the one case where he did share a draft, we would not have had time to cross-reference the various sections of the relevant legislation. So while I welcome the fact that there will be amendments, it would have been very helpful, Mr. President, if we had those amendments before us when the debate is starting. And I'm particularly disappointed because those of us who served on the Joint Select Committee knows we spent a lot of time on many of these issues. We not only raised repeatedly, but we were moved to put it in a minority report on the Joint Select Committee. Nothing was done then. The debate in the House was taken through all its stages. The amendments were not introduced then, even though certainly the leader of the opposition would have highlighted the concerns. So it's very untidy that the debate has now started, and even as the opposition spokesman on national security, I don't have the benefit of seeing these amendments before making my contribution. Nevertheless, it is there. I asked earlier, and the minister said there's a team in the government lounge that's still working on it, but he hopes to make them available before the end of the day.
You want to respond in relation to the availability? Because what I think that you could certainly do too is assure that in committee stage you would give them the member opportunity to address if they are not finished by the time he is completed.
So, we've argued these things before in multiple ways. The facts are, amendments are being, drafting of those amendments are being completed. The teams worked up to very late last night. You'll have them soon. I don't think it affects the opening of the debate. We have the committee stage, which will no doubt last most of the debate tomorrow, and views and ample time, I think, based on what they are, will be provided.
Senator Bunting, you have my assurance that at the committee stage, if you deal with a matter and you are at a disadvantage, I will allow you to go outside the bounds of the clause to address the issues if they arise in committee stage.
Context. There are developments in the international arena, various instruments and protocols at the United Nations, for example, that we have signed on to, but we have not updated our legislation appropriately. So, in a broad sense, the opposition supports this really new Firearms Act, and we only want to caution that we should not expect it by itself to be some sort of to address all the concerns. And let me just start by repeating a couple sentences in the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons. It starts by saying with 85% of the murders recorded yearly, and in brackets, a murder rate of 46.5 per 100,000 attributed to a firearm, it appears that the proliferation of firearms in Jamaica is a direct catalyst for murders committed. Most gun-related crimes are committed using firearms that are outside of the regulated firearms regime, meaning that those firearms are illicitly trafficked, manufactured, or diverted. And it goes on to speak to the various elements of the new legislation. So we must support anything that would move us forward in that regard. In fact, if you look at the latest JCF statistics, while when this memorandum of objects and reasons was written, we were 7 per 100,000. That's an additional 10 per 100,000 year to date. And I take those figures, I haven't invented them, I take it from the most recent periodic crime statistics review published by the Statistics and Information Management Unit of the Jamaica Constabulary Force. And what it shows is that up to September 17th, 2022, we've had 1,108 murders. This is an increase of 82 or 8% relative to the same period last year. If we continue at this pace, we would reach 1,534 murders by year end. A simple extrapolation of the rate of murders year to date to September 17th would result in 1,534 murders by year end. In the week, according to these statistics, in the week ending September 17th alone, there were 45 murders in that week alone. 45 murders, that's more than 6 murders per day on average during that week. There are some other statistics that are of concern. We continue with a clear-up rate of less than 50%. And that clear-up, by the way, doesn't mean that these persons have been arrested and charged. It means, for example, that if someone is killed and they were sought after, they were killed even by a criminal crony, and they were being sought, some of those murders would be attributed to them and categorized as cleared up. If we were to look at the percentage of murders that actually result in the perpetrator being arrested, charged, and convicted, it would be a much, much smaller figure. Another area of concern where firearms are often used, another category, although it's an accusatory category, is robbery. We've had 645 robberies since the start of the year. And of course, this is reported robberies. And that's up 17%, or 94 more cases than in the corresponding period in the prior year. Again, as we know, many of these robberies, firearms are used in the course of the robbery. And the clear-up rate here is less than 30%, perhaps about 25% of the incidents. I would just highlight a couple more points from this, and that really has to do with the areas where these murders are taking place. In the metropolitan divisions, the Kingston and St. Andrew and St. Catherine South, generally speaking, there has been a decline, even in some cases, small decline or level. But when you get to the rural constituencies, you will see St. James, murder up 41%, Trelawney, murder up 154%, Westmoreland, murder up 38%, St. Mary, murder up 93%, Manchester, murder up 126%, St. Elizabeth, up 61%, and St. Thomas, up 88%. So what we're seeing this year is that most of the increase is coming from the rural police divisions. And the final statistic that is relevant to this debate that I want to highlight is arrests for breaches of the Firearms Act. And notwithstanding the increase in murder and robbery, what we'll see is that arrests for breaches of the Firearms Act are actually down by 14% this year. And I highlight that because it will be relevant as I point to some other research. The assumption made in this bill is that these almost what some would describe as draconian sentences, extremely harsh and severe penalties, life imprisonment for possession, simpliciter, for example, will act as a deterrent for crime. And what we know is that this administration is strong on the public relations statements. But we in this Senate have an obligation to be evidence-based. The United States government, Department of Justice, to get some information about deterrence. There's some interesting information here, and I'll share a couple of the findings. The first one says research shows, Senator Brown, research shows clearly that the chance of being caught is a vastly more effective deterrent than even draconian punishment. The certainty of being caught is a vastly more powerful deterrent than the punishment. Now, I contrast that with the reductions, the declines in arrests that we have been seeing for breaches of the Firearms Act. And that could suggest that the certainty of being caught is actually declining. And a clear-up rate of less than 50% is also indicating that you are more likely than not to not be caught. So where our emphasis needs to be is on improving the chance or making it as close as possible to a certainty of being caught, rather than thinking that by just increasing the severity of the punishment, we're going to deter crime. And I'm going to quote again from that site. It says, laws and policies designed to deter crime by focusing mainly on increasing the severity of punishment are ineffective, partly because criminals know little about the sanctions for specific crimes. More severe punishments do not chasten individuals convicted of crimes. Increasing the severity of punishment does little to deter crime. So it's important that we understand that this is no silver bullet. We are not, in all cases, saying that some of the penalties may not be more appropriate. But let us not fool ourselves into thinking that just by increasing the severity, even to draconian levels, is going to have a meaningful impact on reducing our violent crime rate. And I want to turn now to some other technical issues. And this, Mr. President, is the area that not only I would have benefited from seeing these amendments, but certainly the entire debate in the House, which took place a couple of weeks ago, all the participants would have benefited. And that is in two areas in particular. And I am assuming that these are the areas that will be addressed in these amendments. Our principal concern, and what was stated in the minority report submitted by the opposition at the Joint Select Committee, our principal concern related to that principle of the separation of powers, which is a fundamental principle of our governance structure, and the role of the judiciary in adjudicating matters which come before the court. We believe that that sentencing function in the criminal justice system is a fundamental function and responsibility of the judiciary. The principle on which this is based is one of doing justice in the particular case before the court, as an accused person has the right to have their matter adjudicated in a court of law. Clause 5 of the bill imposes mandatory life sentences for several offenses, including possession simpliciter of a firearm. So regardless of the circumstances in which a person is found to be in possession or is found guilty, a life sentence must be imposed. It further goes on to impose a minimum 15-year term before a convicted person becomes eligible for parole. And you know, those of us who have been around a long time, even though we may not be practicing in the court, but when you represent people, you invariably come across cases which seem unfair and unjust. And convictions are only mitigated by a judge using their discretion to give a sentence that they feel is appropriate. And I can recall two cases that I'm personally aware of. One was very long ago when I represented Southeast Clarendon. And there was a grandmother in Freetown who raised 2 grandsons. And, you know, while she did her best, invariably, one or the other of them got mixed up in some gun business. Hid the gun in the grandmother's room, and it was discovered by the police. She was charged and convicted.
15 years now?
My recollection, and this was a long time ago, this was, you know, more than 25 years ago, is that the judge gave, it was a 12-month suspended sentence. There was a second case. Again, someone I knew, a farmer, peasant farmer on the hillsides of St. Andrew. He was being plagued by a thief in the area, all the farmers, thieving them banana, them various produce. These are people who are barely scratching out a living on a hillside. And it was reported that this small farmer threatened the thief that if him catch him thieving on his small plot of land, what him would do to him. And I believe it's quite possible that he did threaten him. But the thief went and reported that he threatened him with a gun, which I've known this person for decades, and I'm certain he has no gun and he has never been mixed up in anything illegal. But in his frustration at his livelihood and that his capacity to take care of his children, he may very well have threatened the thief. His education level was very low. When he went to court to answer the charge, he was completely bewildered by the proceedings that were taking place. He frankly couldn't understand most of it, even though he had representation. And again, he was convicted. Without a physical gun or without any corroboration of anybody else saying that seen him with it, right? Perhaps if he had been able to afford a King's Counsel, it might have been... King's Counsel, that's what I said. If he had been able to afford a King's Counsel, it might have been different. But again, in the discretion of the judge, he was given a suspended sentence. And in my humble opinion, it would have been manifestly unjust to do otherwise. Now, under this law, he would serve a minimum of 15 years. 15 years. So, there is, fortunately, a safety valve, which even before whatever the amendments that may be coming, the Criminal Justice Administration Amendment Act of 2015, which was implemented under the then PNP government, created a safety valve in section 42K of Part 1B, which says that where a defendant has been tried and convicted of an offense that is punishable by a prescribed minimum penalty, and the court determines that, having regard to the circumstances of the particular case, it would be manifestly excessive or unjust to sentence the defendant to the prescribed minimum penalty, the court shall A, sentence the defendant to the prescribed minimum penalty, and B, issue to the defendant a certificate so as to allow the defendant to seek leave to appeal his sentence. So while this is a safety valve, but for the average, for this poor peasant farmer on the hillside, chances are for him to continue to finance these court cases and maintain his family in the meantime, it would have been virtually impossible. But I won't go any further on this, since the minister has indicated that amendments will be coming with respect to this. I would only say that we had asked, because there's a further concern that this bill reverses the effect of Part 1A of the Criminal Justice Amendment Act 2015, which provides a discretion for the court to give discounts for the persons charged if they plead guilty. Many cases, including firearm cases, have been disposed of, and persons have been sent to prison as a result of that provision. This regime, which encouraged guilty persons to plead guilty quickly and reduce the burden on the courts, is no longer the case, as the current bill excludes firearms cases. Again, I don't know if this will be affected by the amendments the minister speaks to. But what I do know is that Senator Motley and others, including myself, repeatedly asked for the data to be brought to the Joint Select Committee so that we could see how effective this 2015 amendment to the Criminal Justice Act had been, how often it was used, how many persons it had resulted in sending to prison, what was the reduction of the burden on the courts. We still have not seen that data. And, perhaps I will have to table some questions to eventually get it. But it would have been very helpful to an informed debate to have had them ahead of today. Now, a lot of this bill goes towards regulating the Firearms Licensing Authority, the FLA. And a lot of it is necessary, but I am concerned that the authority is only as good as the persons who comprise it and as the policy directions they get. Now, I'm not going to comment on the shoot to kill instruction or advocacy of the minister. I think others have dealt with that.
No, don't read the Beatitudes.
Others have dealt with that sufficiently. But one of the challenges that any government faces in an environment of constrained resources, especially with a police force that faces one of the highest crime rates in the world and does that on a sustained basis, is to maintain the morale and motivation of the officers. And one of the issues that I recall dealing with the youth is that there has continued to be what I would describe as a sort of elitism in evaluating persons who apply for firearms.
Senator Bunting, you know that I share your view in relation to this matter for any number of reasons, and I have very serious concerns about what you have just said. It applies not only to the police.
Some of us wanted to remove this sort of general discretion, and there must be clear reasons why. And there are reasons set out, but it is not exhaustive. It still leaves a discretion to the FLA. And I hope the minister will clear it up. And I'm going to cite a specific example. Your mic is off, Mr. President.
Whether or not it remains a power of the board to deny a license to a citizen of this country because it is of the opinion of the board that they have not established a need. I am of the view, reading this, that that no longer exists, and I want to hear it. Just like yourself, I want to hear it.
Well, I'm going to cite a case for you, which I have the correspondence from the FLA. And I'm obviously not going to reveal the identity of the applicant. But let me just say, he's a police officer who has served in his 5th year of service. And as most of the younger officers, they are the ones in the operational units. They are the ones on the front line. They are the ones who the minister is saying they must shoot to kill. And in fact, they have served in the operational units of the toughest police division for most of their time in the JCF. They applied for a personal firearm. And they received a letter this month denying their application. And here is the reason for the said denial of application. And I quote, "Applicant area of residence is of concern and is likely to pose a greater risk to the applicant if a firearm is introduced." This is a police officer.
Wrong address.
This is a police officer with a wrong address. This is a police officer that we're asking to face down criminals on a daily basis. This is a police officer who then, if he doesn't get a keep and care firearm, has to return to his home in a tough community without a firearm because he's denied on the basis of his residence. This, quite frankly, Mr. President, is a disgrace. It is shameful. It is shameful. Well, I hope the minister will speak to this, because persons like this will not be able to get an appeal, because by the time this act is passed and comes into force, the 3 weeks, the 21 days within which you must give appeal would have passed. So they will now have to wait, notwithstanding, for 2 years to reapply. And much of this is still left to administrative arrangements. And Mr. President, I repeat, in the case of young Jamaicans that we're asking out there to go down and face down the same violence producers and bad men day after day, and we are denying them. They have nothing adverse on their record. There's nothing adverse referred to here. And they are denied on the basis of their address. The very address which makes it more likely that they need to defend themselves than if they lived in Cherry Gardens or Jacksonville in a gated community with a 24-hour security. It is unfair, it is elitist, and it is going to work to demoralize the members of the police force. And, you know, since there are many amendments coming, Minister, since there are amendments coming, I would like you to consider a situation like this. But I really don't see any legitimacy in denying persons.
Thank
you. Thank you, Mr. President. The PSOJ recently issued a call covering many things, including consensus. And let me just say that there have been two mechanisms to achieve this consensus. One came out of a crime summit that developed a mechanism called CMOC, the Crime Management Oversight Committee. And there was consensus for a whole series of initiatives and policies there. And to the best of my knowledge, even though many of the deadlines have been passed, some have been achieved, some not held in February, I believe it was, this year. And really, the issues were around, or the discussions covered things like the proposed Enhanced Security Measures Act, which was one of the targets of the crime consensus and one of the issues being monitored, one of the deliverables being monitored by CMOC. But Mr. President, Mr. President, my point is that the only thing that I'm aware of, anything material, debate on that. In fact, the court seems to share the view on many aspects of the government's use of those states of emergency that the opposition held. But as I said, it's before the court. So there's no point in keeping that debate going between us. We shouldn't. And so I am not aware of any outstanding issue as far as the opposition is concerned, or that the opposition can initiate to forward any consensus. We have a consensus document. We have a mechanism to work on it. If the government feels that there is new things that they need, bring them forward, whether to Parliament in the form of legislation or whether any other issue. However, what I will say is that during my participation at CMOC, which has continued throughout since my appointment as opposition spokesperson on national security, one of the points that I have been making privately, and I will make here again in the Senate, I think I've made it before, is that perhaps the major thing, or the most important thing that we could do for the JCF, the manpower, and then to carefully deploy that manpower. Again, in an evidence-based and data-driven way. The truth is, and I don't know what the figures are up to today, but certainly up to the end of last year, there had been no net increase in the size of the JCF for the past 6 years. Efforts had been made to increase recruitment, but for one reason or the other, it barely manages to keep pace with attrition. However, in the meantime, we've launched 2 new branches. We've launched the PSTEP and the Public Safety and Traffic Enforcement branch, and I have previously pointed out that road traffic deaths have increased by about 25% since that that branch was launched. So it can't by any means be seen as effective. And I think everybody would agree that public order in our towns has not increased by any has not improved by any substantial measure. We've also formed a branch called Specialized Operations, which is sort of like the old mobile reserve. I think the idea was to replace, not necessarily identically, but replace the old mobile reserve and provide a tiered response capability, which is necessary. However, at the same time, we doubled the size of the JDF, which also can be used for that same tiered response capability. So we've taken from the 12,000 or so JCF personnel that we have, we've pulled out 2,000 or thereabouts, 15% or thereabouts, and put in these two centralized, specialized units. But meanwhile, the rural divisions, the dramatic increases in terms of murders, percentage murders, the St. James, the Westmoreland, the Manchester, the St. Elizabeth, the St. Thomas.
The areas that are bleeding.
The areas that are bleeding this year, what we've seen a reduction in the personnel on the ground there. So we've sucked out more, and bear in mind, when you have a specialized ops, it is the younger police officers, the ones who are in better condition to go and physical condition to conduct operations. So when you pull out 15% of those, you are actually depleting the operational capability in the divisions by more than that, because there are a lot of older police personnel who would be doing administrative tasks, etc. And so it is not surprising that we're seeing the increase that we're seeing in these rural police divisions. And when I say personnel lost from these divisions, Mr. President, what I mean is they retire, they resign, in some cases they may die. It could, not necessarily in terms of criminal confrontation, but motor vehicle accidents, illness. They're suspended, they're on interdiction, or they have some chronic illness which keeps them out of the day-to-day deployment. And, Mr. President, I've looked on statistics, and what it suggests that in the last 6 years, these divisions have lost hundreds of personnel, and they have acquired less than half of what they've lost. And it only makes mathematical sense, because if you've pulled thousands to put in these centralized units, your net number hasn't increased. Those thousands have to come from somewhere, and they've come from these divisions now that are bleeding. And I don't want to be said that we don't make recommendations, because we do. And I'm saying that these divisions, they were started with great expectations. These centralized branches, the P-STEP and the specialized ops, they have not delivered as expected. There is nothing wrong in wheel and come again. Said to the government, wheel and come again. Because I know if those approximately 2,000 persons were deployed to the capable commanders out in the West, for example, they would have a much bigger impact on reducing murders in this country than in their centralized barracks in Kingston, where they are. So, Mr. President, in concluding, let me just say that the opposition acknowledges the need for an updated Firearms Act, and we support it on an overall basis. We've raised a couple of specific concerns. We raised it in the Joint Select Committee, It was raised in the debate in the lower house, and I touched on some of those today, and I believe other members in their contribution will raise the concerns. Notwithstanding those concerns, we support the bill overall, and we believe that whatever shortcomings will either be tested in the court or hopefully adjusted in the amendment process. We caution, however, that research shows that the certainty of being caught is a vastly more powerful deterrent than even draconian punishment. We recommend that the operations of the FLA be managed and directed in an objective manner, not an arbitrary and capricious manner. We ask in particular that it not be used in a way that demoralizes or demotivates our frontline personnel in either the GSCF, the JDF, the correctional services, as you added, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President. And we reaffirm our commitment to the consensus process and the mechanisms that exist Royal, and we close with a recommendation that for an adjustment in strategy to stop sending our best, fittest young men and our best equipment, young men and women and our best equipment to these centralized units, which is preparing them for, to combat a large force when we have already increased the capacity of the JDF to provide this tiered response capability. And we instead deploy them on a geographic basis to strengthen our rural divisions where the vast majority of the increases in murders this year have been taking place. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Bunting. Just before you start, Senator Rodriguez, I had intended to break now, but since I understand that there is an agreement between the leaders that we would not continue beyond this speaker, I'm going to ask Senator Campbell Rodriguez to make her contribution now. Madam Clerk, and this is really for the staff of the chamber who would want her. Am I misunderstanding?
I think the intention may have been to communicate it because we initially thought it was just one from either side today, but we have no objection to a second speaker from the government.
No, that I was counting Senator Rodriguez, I was going beyond Senator Rodriguez. There is no intention to go beyond Senator Rodriguez.
It was my hope that more persons would have presented and we'd have furthered it.
Not today.
It was my hope that we would have had more persons present today and we'd have furthered the debate with the intent, because we will close tomorrow. But I have no objections, President.
Senator Bunting.
Mr. President.
Senator Bunting, let me explain something to you. I'm recently aware of my powers as the...
President, there's...
So what I'm going... Senator Samuda, in all fairness, we have a list of amendments that we still have not seen. So I'm going to take Senator Rodriguez now and ask that we make an early start in the morning.
Just so that everyone is clear that we're taking it through the concluding stations tomorrow. No problem.
That has been made very pellucid.
No
there
problem,
goes
President.
that word again. Senator Rodriguez Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to thank Senator Bunting because you have saved me the need to go back through the statistics which prove the reason we truly need this bill. So I want to thank you for saving me that time. But, Mr. President, in Jamaica, gun violence is a daily problem. And it doesn't just affect the victims. So it's not just the persons who get shot or who get killed by the gun that are affected. It's families, it's schools, churches, communities. Everybody is impacted by gun violence. The fear of guns, even just the fear of guns, affect our lives. In some communities, it affects persons sending their children out to schools. It affects them because parents are concerned that if they send out the child, there could be gun violence and they could lose their children. It happens the same way. When there's a flare-up in some communities, people don't visit the health centers because of that fear of the violence. So we know without a doubt that the gun violence in Jamaica is a serious problem. Now, this government, as do all governments across the world, have an obligation to maximize the protection of human rights, creating the safest possible environment for the most people, especially those considered to be at the greatest risk. Now, that's a quote from Amnesty International. Now, Mr. President, violence through the use of a firearm is a matter which directly affects our most fundamental human right, which is the right to life. So all our human rights are violated by the excessive use of firearms by criminals. And it is the responsibility of the government to protect people and to uphold that human right, that right to life. Mr. President, if a state, if any country does not exercise adequate control over the possession and use of firearms in the face of persistent gun violence, this amounts to a breach of the obligation of the government. Mr. President, in Jamaica, data indicates that crime and violence disproportionately affects youth. Young men, for example, those between the ages of 16 to 24, are at the forefront of violent crimes in Jamaica, particularly gun crimes. This is sad. This is something that is going to affect the country in the future, if not curbed. And has been stated over and over again, the criminality in Jamaica didn't happen overnight. It happened systematically over 30 years. And we have not, as a country, responded systematically enough over the 30 years to prevent the problem from getting to where it has gotten today. That is also sad. Young people need a chance. They need opportunities to thrive and model behaviors to emulate. Our young people need reasons to not continue this trend of violence. Mr. President, a major deterrent to behavior is harsh penalties. So, Senator Bunting, I disagree with you fundamentally that harsh measures will not help this situation. Tell that to the mothers who have been crying when their sons have been killed. Tell that to the fathers who are crying when their daughters are held up at gunpoint. All our grannies, every one of us, our grandmothers have told us at some point or the other, actions have consequences. We must have a system where those with the tendency towards picking up a gun feel as though it is not worth it. The aim is to change the risk-reward factor. If what you are getting when you use a firearm is a harsh penalty, you will think twice. There is no doubt about that. That's basic psychology. So, this bill is not perfect to give law-abiding citizens breathing room to live without fear of gun crimes. That's what we're seeking to do here. Mr. President, the firearms prohibition, restriction, and regulation Act of 2022 seeks to effectively deal with the proliferation, trade, and use of firearms. This bill marks, in my mind, a potential turning point in Jamaica. This is to be the start of a turn for Jamaica as a less violent society. Mr. President, while I have decided to not focus on specific sections of the bill, it would be remiss of me not to highlight Clause 58(3)(d). And the reason I'm highlighting it, Mr. President, is because quite often we talk about gender issues in the House. And Clause 58(3)(d) says, no firearm authorization shall be granted under this section to a person who is charged with or detained in respect of an offense involving domestic violence. This is a step forward for not just lessening the numbers of persons who have guns who shouldn't, but it shows that women and the problems we face, they matter. You beat women, you can't get a licensed firearm. If you beat men, you can't get a licensed firearm. Domestic violence, I am happy that it is being considered here. Now, I also take this opportunity and I take the liberty, Dr. Longmore, because you're the medical doctor here, to say also that this is an opportune time for us to look, because further in Clause 58, I think it's 3E3, it mentions mental health issues, as do most of the legislation that we see coming before us. Just a call for us to review the existing Mental Health Act, because there's work there that needs to be done which will affect all other legislation. I also want to highlight Clause 102. And Clause 102 says a person who assaults, obstructs, hinders or resists or uses any threatening language to an authorized officer executing any function on this act, under this act, commits an offense and shall be liable on summary conviction before a parish court to a fine not exceeding $1 million, or on default of payment of that fine to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year. And I'm highlighting this because I want to remind our people. We sometimes turn on the news at 7 o'clock and we see where people are attacking police for different things. Stop bad up the people doing their jobs to curb criminality in Jamaica. It's written right here. It is an offense to do so. Now, Clause 85, which speaks to the cancellation of a firearm. So Clause 85, it speaks to the cancellation of a firearm authorization on the death of a holder. The bill says that on death, the license is to be cancelled and notice must be given to the personal representative of the deceased. And I'm hoping that the team that is here from MNS can help me to understand. I'm asking whether the process for this will be included in the regulations. Given, I wonder, how will the authority know who is the representative of the deceased and their location in order to carry out this section? So I'd love to hear from the team through the minister whether or not that is something that will come in the regulations. Mr. President, the Firearms Act that this bill seeks to repeal is from 1967. 1967, before I was born. As our Prime Minister stated in his independence message, and I just want to highlight something here. In his independence message, the Prime Minister said, as we celebrate, of course, the phone is going to go very slowly because I need that section as right now. Basically, it says, as we celebrate our 60th year of independence, I know that many Jamaicans are deeply disturbed by the high levels of violence and disorder in our domestic and public interactions. Security and public safety law enforcement, and public order are primary concerns for Jamaicans. Our society has changed much faster than the legislative framework necessary to preserve social order. At the time of our independence, we did not contemplate the level of access to weapons. And remember, our independence was just 5 years before this, the original. At the time of our independence, we did not contemplate the level of access to weapons and the rampant use of violence and offenses against the person. We did not foresee drugs and human trafficking, cybercrimes and scamming, or the pervasiveness of criminal gangs on an enterprise scale. But the problems exist. And so the legislation has to be changed, and it has to be changed within the context of what is happening. And what is happening in Jamaica is that we have a crisis with criminality and also with the use of firearms. And as such, we have to act accordingly. Mr. President, I wholeheartedly support this bill and look forward to it becoming law in the very, very near future, if it pleases you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rodriguez Campbell. Minister, I think you're going to ask for the suspension of the debate.
Yes, President. I ask that the debate be suspended.
Question is that the debate be suspended until tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m.
God's willing. Tomorrow morning, that would be Friday, September 23 at 10 a.m. At 10 a.m. Any other business today, Mr. Minister?
No, Mr. President. It's not intended to conduct any. I don't think we need on this particular point. No, but it's not intended to do any further business for the day.
Thank you very much. The members would have heard the minister's question, which is specifically that the Senate be adjourned to Friday, September 23 at 10 a.m. Those in favor? Against? This Honorable Senate now stands adjourned until Friday, September 23, 2022. DV.
Thank you.